am Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This present video is the second of two that I have prepared as an introduction to my Survey of British Literature course. In the course, I pay a special attention to the socio-historical context in which the literary texts were produced. In the earlier video, I discussed the condition of being human in relation to political and economic changes from the medieval period through modernity and into postmodernity. Here I will focus on some cultural factors such as religion, education, and art during those periods. And I'll say something about the fragmentation of the individual characteristic of our postmodern era. Finally, I'll say something about how religion, for instance, has related to these changes in the experience of being human in different historical periods. And let me preface this by saying one way I like to think of literature is that these systems, literature, the educational system, the family system, religion, are sort of like the software that helps us manage the technology of being human. They tell us that either by formulating prescriptions or by making more subtle suggestions simply in the structuring and ordering things. So in the feudal era, Roman Catholicism in Western Europe was the religion. And it wasn't just that the authority system of Roman Catholicism asserted that it must be adhered to. It was also that in a system like that, it would be difficult to imagine not simply agreeing to what everybody else knew to be true. And there are rare examples of people trying to think outside that box. Some of them were martyred and others were just ignored. Modernity is characterized above all in Western Europe by the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and John Calvin challenging this dominance of the Catholic Church and saying that the individual should have a direct connection, the individual Christian should have a direct connection to God, to the Creator. Notice how that emphasizes the individual's religious experience as opposed to the subject having a religious experience that is mediated through a church hierarchy. Let me talk a little bit about the conditions of knowledge production. In the medieval period, what is true is simply what God has ordained. Knowledge is assumed to be derived from God. Knowledge is divine. The truth is divine. And the priests of the Catholic Church are the voices or the arbiters of that. But in modernity, along with the rise of individualism, the rise of the middle class, and the spread of first printing in vernacular languages, and soon education more broadly distributed, scientific rationalism becomes the criteria by which truth is judged. And religion loses ground consistently over the centuries to science in determining what most people will take as truth, and also in determining how the society will organize itself for reproducing its conditions of reproduction, or for producing its conditions of reproduction, including in the educational system. So, whereas in medieval Europe, those who were educated would be educated in the study of Greek and Hebrew and Latin in order to translate the Bible and transcribe it, and in theology. At this time, in the Middle Ages, what you learned was what had been passed down from the ancient authorities. So Aristotle said this, Ptolemy said this about the universe, Plato said this. You began by assuming that they had it right, then you might add something to it. But sometimes they had it quite wrong. Those thinkers all thought that the sun and the planets all went around the earth. Not true, right? planets go around the sun. When Galileo, with his telescope, after Copernicus and Kepler, determined that the Earth was going around the sun, and he published it in a book, not in Latin, which only the elites could read, but even in Italian, which anyone in Italy who could read, it led to his eventual appearance before the Inquisition and his final house arrest, because the church said, the Bible says, the sun goes around the earth. Scientific experiment, actually observing and recording phenomena and collecting and organizing data are important. And knowledge, scientific knowledge, is built incrementally. You don't always go back to Aristotle or Plato or Galen or Ptolemy. You read the latest research and see what someone has discovered, and you see if there's a refinement to be made, or you try to reproduce the experiment and see if it works for you. Well, that eventually leads to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment sees human reason as the epitome of human achievement and as really what makes us human. Not as in the medieval period when it was assumed that God gives us a soul and that's what makes us human. More and more, it's that I'm thinking myself into existence or into my subjectivity, and that's what makes us human. Does anyone know René Descartes' famous slogan related to this? Yes, Sarah?
Cogito ergo sum.
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Right? Even though Descartes was a serious Catholic, he comes up with this slogan, and this becomes the defining characteristic of what it is to be human in modernity. And of course, lots of us still think we have souls, and we still want to go to heaven, and we think that we are human because God has given us a soul. But we act like what's really important is that we are thinking and advancing, having progress, and working together to create a better future. Hence, Michigan Tech's slogan, create the future. And increasingly, we depend upon quantification and statistics to define who we are. The Human Genome Project. Now, a big part of what it is to be human depends on our DNA. It can tell you if you're likely to get cancer, it can tell you who your real parents are, all sorts of things like that. It changes our thinking about who we are and how we can think about it. In postmodernity, the knowledge system is assumed then to be contingent and to have a social material basis. You can't have an idea in a vacuum. You can't think of something that no one's ever thought before completely. Or if you could, you wouldn't be able to know you were thinking it. If you think, for example, that I sometimes have a thought that I don't have a word for, this system would say, when you're thinking you have a thought that you don't have a word for, the word for that thought is this thought that I have that I don't have a word for. It's a long word for that thought. But if you didn't mark it off with that long word, this thought that I think I have that I don't have a word for, as one word, you wouldn't be able to define where that thought ends and you're thinking about eggs and bacon, or something else on the edges of it, and what you're going to do later. So human thought and language has a social and material basis. It doesn't just drop out of the sky. It's not like Descartes would say, I get born, I'm a blank slate, John Locke, and I begin to develop my mind in interaction with the natural environment, social environment that I find. It's more than that. And knowledge is situated, I said that earlier in the earlier PowerPoint. All knowledge is contextualized, in some ways contingent or situated in relation to other possible knowledges and other ways of thinking, and possibly may change. Truth is contingent. Now I'd like to show you a couple of images to try to illustrate two different ways of thinking about the relationship of the individual subject to the larger society. The first characteristic of the Middle Ages, and the second one representing a way of thinking about the individual in modernity. This is a scene from the Paris Fair of 1400 by an anonymous painter. It shows a bishop or high priest of some kind with some other religious dignitaries in a bell tower of a church at the center of a market. All around the figures in the bell tower are ordinary people going about their daily lives in the market. There's a baker and a butcher, and there's a man on horseback and a shepherd with some sheep. Smaller figures. All of those people are represented as smaller than the people at the center of the picture in the bell tower. That's because the people in the bell tower are the most important people in the society. Everyone else is secondary to them. The lives of everyone else revolve around those important people. For this painter, the goal is to represent the social hierarchy of this society in his painting. Now, consider this painting by Pietro Perugino, painted around 1481 to 1482. It's a fresco in the Sistine Chapel. Perugino's painting also shows us some large figures and some small figures. The Perugino uses the optical illusion of the converging lines of the tiles in the plaza to indicate that the small figures are really the same size as the larger ones. The people just appear smaller because they are farther away. There are some important people here. That's Christ handing the keys to St. Peter at the center of the scene. But Christ is represented as human scale. In effect, Perugino is taking for granted a fundamentally humanist, realistic, modern perspective that is quite different from that of the painter of the market scene just 80 years prior. With that, I'll conclude this webcast. But, as always, if you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to send me an email.